Hi, this is Jay Bailey, and welcome to Words Matter. This video is the result of about 3 decades of writing, editing, correcting, and tutoring students and employees, even clients, on writing effectively. I've identified 10 areas of weakness that I see over and over, and being aware of them and working on them a little bit will dramatically improve the way you write. Now, this is not an elementary or high school writing lesson. It doesn't cover every English rule. It's specifically for business people who write as a part of their jobs, which is fairly common, it's most of us, but know that they have some room to improve. Before we get started, you don't have to take aggressive notes as you watch the following video. Essentially, I'm hoping that you'll use this as a checklist. Every time you put together a document, whether it's something formal or informal, you can print out the PDF from the link that I'll give you at the end of this video and hang it on a bulletin board. And before finishing up and sending off your document, you can make sure that you've stuck to the rules and created the best, most effective piece of writing you can. Now, if you're already here, I obviously don't need to convince you that words matter in life in general and in business in particular. But let's just put one thing down on the table. People perceive you, and you make an impression, in 2 ways generally. One is your physical appearance, and second, the way that you communicate. So there's not a lot I can do about your physical appearance, but when you write correctly, it gives the impression that you are experienced, that you're well-read, that you're intelligent, skilled, reliable, confident, all characteristics that someone in business would be looking for in a partner or a colleague or vendor, etc. So writing well isn't quite a nice to have or a luxury. If you want to get ahead, if you want to make the right impressions, frankly, if you want to succeed and further your career, effective writing is an absolutely critical part of that. Now that we've got that out of the way, let's move on to our first rule. Rule number 1, start out by vomiting at your desk. Okay, that sounds a little gross. But before you start obsessing over all the rules that we're about to go through, you want to make sure that the basic ideas, the content of your message, goes from your head onto your screen. So before you start obsessing about following these rules, just get everything out of your head. Don't worry about things like grammar, punctuation, vocabulary, repetitiveness, wordiness, or any of the rules that we're about to go through. When you focus too hard on both the content and following rules of good writing, you often don't achieve 100% accuracy in either one. So the first step, just create your vomit draft. Ignore the rules, get the text onto the screen. Doesn't matter how bad it looks, nobody's going to see it but you, and then we move on to polishing it up. Rule number 2, avoid vague words. What do we mean by that? In almost all cases, there's an ideal form to get an idea across effectively. Ideally, there are a small number of words required to get that idea across, but most important is precision. For instance, let's take the word things and lock it up, throw away the key. I actually have an auto replace on my computer in Microsoft Word, and when I type the word thing or things, it automatically replaces it with a bunch of X's to remind me not to use the word. And then I go back and I put in a more effective term. Here's an example. When planning our product launch, we need to prepare to deal with 2 things. Now, there's always going to be a more specific term. Challenges, potential objections, questions, customer reactions, possible outcomes. The list goes on and on. The point is to paint as specific a picture as possible. Here's another example. People. You're never talking about people in general or mankind. You're generally talking about customers or site visitors or citizens, experts, students, managers, whatever it is. That's another word that you can stick in your autocorrect and replace it with a bunch of X's. And if you're sensitive to this, you'll find over time that there are probably a half dozen words that you use fairly often that are nonspecific. And I'm not necessarily talking about using a thesaurus to find fancier words than you're used to using. I mean, stay away from vague general terms. Now, this all comes back to a phrase I like to use, don't make me think. It's actually the title of a book. It was a term coined in 2000 by Steve Krug. He was talking about website design and software design. And his point was that you want the content or the functionality to take the front seat. You don't want your audience to have to think through, process, or decode the wording you use, or try to deduce what it is that you meant. Even if it takes an extra fraction of a second, it slows down the process and the effectiveness of your message. So whether it's marketing material, an informal email or formal email, fiction, user guides, memoirs, proposals, look at the wording you use and try to figure out whether your audience is going to need to have to think as opposed to immediately and effectively absorb your terminology. It also helps with the impression you make. We're all familiar with "a picture's worth 1,000 words." Take a look at these two sentences. "I'm working hard at solving your problem and hope to have an answer soon." So that's this guy who's kind of sitting there, and we hear sentences like this all the time, and you can be sort of skeptical about how seriously he's taking it. It sounds almost like an auto-response or a form letter. But now let's think in terms of show, don't tell. Create a kind of visual picture instead of just telling a story. I'll sit here at my desk till the sun goes down with my phone on silent so I can focus on your problem. You're creating an image. You're creating a more authentic picture that the reader can visualize, and it makes a big, big difference. So, use very, very specific words. And when possible, make sure they trigger images and not just abstract thoughts. Rule number 3, get the guts up front. This is a quick trick that's improved the grades of many a college student. Let's compare these two sentences. The people here have serious concerns and are asking questions about the age and health of the horse. Until we get to the last phrase, we're not even sure what the subject of the sentence is. We know there are people, we know they have concerns, but it's kind of trying our patience as we wait to find out what they're actually concerned about. If we switch it around, the horse's age and health are the subject of serious concerns among the people here. From the second word, you already know what the subject of the sentence is. This is perhaps one of the top 3 of all the rules we're going to go through. When I edit a press release for a client, I often find that up to a third of the sentences feature the main subject or the main point all the way at the end. To confirm you're doing it right, think about the subject of the sentence. What is the sentence talking about? 9 times out of 10, you want to keep that word or term or phrase right up there in the first third of the sentence. This is a quick, easy way to dramatically improve your sentence structure. Take a look at something you've written recently, whether it's something formal or just an inter-office email, and you'll see that you can make improvements all over the place. Rule number 4, chop it up. Today, for better or for worse, we find ourselves in the smartphone era. Doesn't really matter what age you are, we all like reading smaller, shorter sentences. Often, especially in business writing, we tend to write longer, more complex sentences, both so that we sound sophisticated, also because it helps us feel like we're making a mini official speech, or sharing a complex idea, which naturally needs a complex sentence to express it. But you can take the exact same concept, break it up into smaller pieces, give each one a little bit more of a punch, and come out with a better result. Here's an example of a sentence that is grammatically valid and not too terrible to read. Competition for business begins as early in the morning as 7 a.m., when the local restaurants and coffee shops try to attract people leaving their homes to get their days started, whether for work, school, or leisure. Right? Sounds good. I understand what it's saying, but let's compare it to the bottom sentence. Local restaurants and coffee shops begin competing for customers early in the morning. Each hopes to attract the breakfast crowd as they emerge bleary-eyed for their morning coffee and bagel. Customers are on their way to work, some to school, and some to begin an all-day tour of the sites. Now you'll notice here that I also bumped up the vocabulary, using one of our earlier rules where we use more precise words and try to show rather than tell. But the fact that each one of these sentences can contain its own idea. The first one is what the restaurants and coffee shops are doing, how all these people look and what specifically they're hoping for, and finally, the different categories of customers. Now again, the top is a completely valid sentence. The rewrite at the bottom is simply easier to read and gives us the opportunity to enrich each phrase with more detail and color. Keep in mind that if you do a word count, the math may show you that the second selection is a drop longer than the first, but the fact that it's broken up still makes it easier to read. Using long sentences to economize and trim down word count simply isn't always the best idea. If you try to pack all of that into a single sentence, it does start to get clunky. So when in doubt, chop it up. No one's ever going to complain about short, concise sentences, but they may get annoyed if a sentence seems to run on a bit too long. Next, stop being you for just a minute. I don't mean stop being you, I'm sure you're great, but you come to the table with background knowledge, with terms and acronyms, history and logic, experience in your business. Sometimes it's even the same business as someone else, but maybe you leverage different vocabulary for the same term. As you review your first draft, put yourself in the reader's seat. Keep it basic enough for them to digest easily, keeping in mind that the reader often doesn't have the time, patience, inclination, or sometimes even the need to figure out what you're trying to get at with the scientific or business or medical terminology or acronyms that you see every day, and they may not. Again, just like we said about the short sentences, rarely will somebody complain when you've written in simple, down-to-earth, basic terminology. But you do run the risk of losing the attention span of someone who's not involved in the same level of your sector as you are. Rule number 6, semicolons. Let's simply demonstrate this one with text that uses semicolons correctly. Semicolons connect two independent clauses. Now remember, a clause is basically one of the chunks that makes up a sentence. Each clause could be its own sentence. As you see here, you could replace that first semicolon with a period, and each one of those two would be an independent sentence that would survive on its own. So why didn't we do that, and why are we using a semicolon? Because we specifically do want to connect them. The second clause, which you don't capitalize by the way, clarifies or expands on the first. So we're using a semicolon when you make an initial sentence and then want to add an additional piece of information. Now that piece of information is not critical to the first sentence, stands alone as its own idea, and doesn't begin with a conjunction like and or so, because you wouldn't begin an independent sentence like that. You can begin with however, comma. Now let's move on. The previous sentence is an example of proper usage. Okay, that's a standalone sentence. It makes sense to master this technique. Now why do I use a semicolon here? Because the next clause is going to explain why it makes sense to master this technique. It's actually the way we speak most of the time, using vaguely connected statements rather than standalone ones. If you wanted to demonstrate this, simply record a conversation that you have with a friend and play it back. If you were to transcribe it, you'd find it would be riddled with semicolons, not periods. The semicolon is by far one of the punctuation marks used most rarely by even advanced business writers, who often prefer simply to use a period and make sentences much more independent, or use a comma. And that brings us to rule number 7. Commas are not used for taking a breath. Now, the use of commas can be an entire lesson on its own, and the rules can be fairly complex. You can construct excellent sentences with a lot of commas, and you can construct equally good sentences with minimal commas. In short, there's a lot of variety based on writing style, and it's usually not about right and wrong. But let's take a look at this example where it is actually incorrect. The one mistake that people most often make is to use a comma as if they're speaking, sort of to break up the words of a sentence, but not necessarily the ideas. Take a look at this. Many of the writers I know use a lot more commas than are required to get the idea across. Now, there's one idea here. It is that the writers, the subject here, use a lot more commas than are required. That's what they're doing. And to get the idea across. That's why they're doing it. It would be the same as a simple English sentence like, he ate the apple because he was hungry. Few people would put a comma in a sentence like that. It's all one idea, and yes, when you say it out loud, you would pause briefly in the places where we see those commas. But it doesn't make for clear writing. Take the second sentence. This document is informal, useful for the corporate communicator, but isn't quite a classic school text. Here's the first idea, the fact that the document's informal. 2, the fact that it's useful. And 3rd, the caveat that it's not quite a school text. 3 different ideas, broken up correctly by commas. One of the ways to know that you made the mistake, let's go back to the first sentence, is that you have the writers, who are the subject, but you haven't had them do anything. Generally, you know there's something wrong if there's a comma breaking up the subject and the verb describing what they do. Again, correct comma usage is fairly complex with dozens of rules, but if you keep this one in mind, don't use it simply because you would be taking a breath when you say it out loud, you'll find it eliminates a good number of extra commas. Rule number 8, that and which. And this is one that actually confuses even pretty serious experienced writers. We'll see if we can simplify it and give you the 99% rule. We use the word that to introduce crucial information that must be in the sentence. It's not important, but it's called a restrictive clause. Here's an example. Wine and beer are the newest products that will appear on our e-commerce site. You wouldn't say wine and beer are the newest products, period, I mean, you technically could, but you wouldn't necessarily because, first of all, the intent of the sentence is about the website. Also, when we say newest, it means it's comparing it to something else. So, if we look at the second half, will appear on our e-commerce site is a critical part of that sentence. Now, which adds extra information that could be cut out. For instance, let's launch the new website, which is going to generate some serious revenue. As you see, the second half is playing off of the first, kind of like what we discussed with a semicolon. These are more or less two separate ideas. As a matter of fact, you could use a semicolon. You could say, let's launch the new website, semicolon. It's going to generate some serious revenue. But back to our scenario, which again, technically is called a non-restrictive clause, adds extra information that could be cut out, and the sentence would still exist just fine without the clarification. This can be a little hard to remember, so here's a little trick for you. Remember how which is one where we could get rid of the second half of the sentence? Well, nobody needs a which to stick around. Rule number 9, write like you speak. It may just be a function of the business world's relaxing of some of business etiquette and the formality that dominated for centuries. But when it comes down to it, there's one very simple truth. The most busy CEO, the most technical CTO, or the most numbers-oriented CFO would all still rather read plain, readable English. Write the way your reader is used to reading. Nobody likes stuffy, stodgy writing. It doesn't add to meaning, it doesn't make it easier to read, and it's simply not natural. For instance, it's really okay most of the time to use contractions. Consider this sentence. We will agree that she does not have to speak if she says she cannot because it is late. Have you ever gone up to somebody in a party and said, "Alas, it is late"? Put the contractions in and everybody's happier. We'll agree that she doesn't have to speak if she can't because it's late. Another trick, which is frequently relevant, not always, is to make it personal. Instead of talking in the third person about an abstract concept, this hat is designed for hikers and protects them from sunburn. Inject a little bit of you and me. If you're a hiker, this hat will protect your head from sunburn. Psychologically, it simply allows someone to put themselves into the picture and establishes a relationship between you, your company, and the people you're talking to. Again, it's not always relevant, but keep an eye out for opportunities to do it. It helps take an idea from the abstract and theoretical and brings it down to earth. It's the way that we talk. It should be the way that you write. Unfortunately, for anyone who's read a legal contract, this mindset hasn't yet bubbled down to the lawyers. I think we'll all be happier when it does. Finally, Rule 10. And it's amazing to me that we actually have to say this, but always proof and spell check. Every single document you create, a letter, a memo, blog, social media post, web content, email, should be spell checked and grammar checked. With the current technology, there's no reason to send out correspondence of any kind with mistakes. Obviously, you ought to turn on the spelling and grammar functions in Microsoft Office and in your browser. There's a product called Grammarly. I have no business interest, I'd simply use it myself and I think it's pretty cool, that not only checks spelling and grammar by underlying problems on the fly and offering solutions, but can also spot typos and bad sentence structure. It works in a browser and in Microsoft Office, and it's really worth the money. There are probably a dozen other products that do similar things. Using it, I no longer ask a colleague to proofread any important communication that I write because I'm no longer afraid that I'm going to have silly mistakes. In the old days, the rule used to be to have someone else proofread your writing because something in the human brain doesn't allow you to spot mistakes that you yourself made. You simply glance over them as the part of your mind that allowed you to make the mistake in the first place allows it to slip through again. When someone else reads it, they can usually spot them. A couple of other tricks. Both on a Mac and a PC, there are ways to have the computer read you out loud the text that you wrote, which is a great way to spot mistakes. And also, if you change the font and the color temporarily, it sometimes detours around that part of your brain that recognizes the text and spots those mistakes as well. But again, using online correct-as-you-type technology, neither of those extra steps should be required. Think about it. If you've mastered all of the other 9 rules here, it's a real shame to have a document you've worked so hard to create come across as sloppy or substandard simply because you left in a couple of unintentional typos. And this brings us to the end of our discussion. As I mentioned in the beginning, once you familiarize yourself with these 10 rules, they'll become a natural part of your writing experience. Below is a link to a PDF that lists each one of these rules briefly. Print it out, keep it nearby when you write, and refer to it as a quick checklist, either while you're writing or at the final stage where you think the document is in fact complete. Thanks for being with us, and we hope you agree that words matter.